We're learning the fourth Sikha and Chelek Zayin from Parshas Vayikra. This shir is being learned L'Nishmas Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin ben Rabbi Menashe Koltman. This Sikha here is divided in two parts. The first part of the Sikha will be discussing a unique carbon called carbon ha'etzim, where a person donates wood itself for a carbon. And we'll bring different shittas here and different scenarios and defining exactly what the halacha of this carbon is. In the second part of the Sikha, the Rabbi will discuss a l'shita sayu, a certain approach of thinking and understanding between Rabbi and the Rabbanan, where we find a certain approach that they have in many different places in Shas. We have this concept in Gemara, and the Rabbi also in Sichas many times discusses and points out a certain understanding that we can see that certain Tanoim argue and you see in a lot of places. Let's begin. From Pasik v'nefesh ki sakriv carbon mincha v'gaimer unit ki sakriv mincha. The Pasik says if one brings a carbon mincha, so that word carbon is an extra word. It doesn't just say if you'll bring a mincha. A mincha is a carbon which is made up of flour and oil, generally. So the extra word of carbon comes to teach me something. So in the Teres Kainim says that what this teaches me is as a yachid can menadav zayin oich levaina yayin shemen, that a yachid can donate even one component of this carbon as a carbon for itself. The levaina, the frankincense which is brought with this carbon, or the yayin, wine, or shemen, or oil, was kumin zusammen mit dem carbon, which come together with the carbon. They can each be brought individually and separately as a donation as a carbon. On oicheitzim. The Teres Kainim says that this refers also to wood itself, even though wood is usually brought on the Mizbeach to burn the karbanis, but you can donate the wood itself as a carbon. Hayachid misnadav eitzim. An individual could donate wood as a carbon. Weiter steht in Teres Kainim. Then the Teres Kainim continues and gives the following condition. Kishem shein shnayim meviin mincha. Just like the halach is regarding a carbon mincha, that partners cannot donate together a carbon mincha. Regarding other karbanis, an animal or from a bird, so partners can partner together to donate a carbon. But when it comes to a mincha, it could only be brought by an individual. So too these donations that we spoke about that you can bring from one component of the mincha as a donation, as a carbon, a meviin lo yayin v'lo levaina v'lo yaitzim. A yachid himself could donate a yayin and a levaina or a wood for a carbon, but not partners. You cannot bring these donations as a carbon in a partnership. So based on this, so the Rabbi, as I mentioned, will focus on the carbon ha'etzim. So we have, if so, the following question regarding the wood. We find a carbon ha'etzim was is gebracht geworden b'shutfes. The carbon ha'etzim was brought as a partnership. The carbon ha'etzim from the Tes Mishpachas. This is a Gemara towards the end of Tainis, where it speaks about 9 different families that donated wood to the Mizbeach. Wie the Mishnah sagt in Tainis, the Mishnah there says in the end of Tainis, Zman Atzi HaKainim V'Ha'am Tisha, that were 9 different dates for different families of Kainim and from the Yidden Bechlal that brought these Eitzim as a carbon on the Mizbeach. And the Gemara is Masber. The Gemara there says the history of how this came to be, that there were these 9 families that brought the wood for a carbon. Keshalu b'nei HaGoyla, when the Yidden came to the second Beis HaMikdash from Golus, le'matzu eitzim b'lishka, they didn't have enough wood in the lishka, in the chamber where they kept the wood. V'amdu eilu, and these families got up and v'isnadvu mishalahem, and they donated from their own wood that they had. They brought it to the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore, after this, v'kach hisnu neviim shebinayim, the neviim amongst them made the following condition. They instituted the following thing for future generations: shafilu lishka malei eitzim, that even when the chamber is full of enough wood, yiyu elu misnadvim mishalahem. There are certain dates where these families come and donate the wood that they have for a carbon. Shanemar, as the pasuk says, "V'hagoyrolois hipalnu al carbon ha'etzim hakainim v'alavim v'ha'am," that they made a lottery for this carbon called carbon ha'etzim that these families donated for different times in the year when they'll bring this eitzim as a carbon. Lahavi lebeis lekenu, lebeis aviseinu, leitim uzumanim, designated times, shana b'shana every year, levayir as mizbach Hashem lekenu kakasav b'teira, for the fire on the mizbeach, as it says in the Torah. That's the story, the way the Gemara describes regarding this carbon ha'etzim that these families brought in designated times in the year. Was von Pashtus Hemshach HaSipur Pasik und der Mishnah, if you look at the story there and what it says in the Pasik and what the Mishnah says, is mashma, das ist gebracht geworden von den Bnei HaMishpacha zusammen. These were families that donated together this wood as a carbon, als schutzwistige carbon von der Mishpacha. It was a carbon of a partnership of the whole family together that brought it as a carbon. So the question here is, if it says in the Teiris Kainim that carbon or eitzim is similar to a carbon mincha that cannot be brought in partnership, so how can we say here that there are these families that bring carbon eitzim on designated dates with b'shutfis, partnership, or the families together? So b'pashtos, looking at this simply, what we can't verempferen, you would answer and say as follows. As der din von nidvis eitzim and Teiris Kainim. This that it says in the Teiris Kainim that an individual could bring a carbon from wood. Red wegen an anderes Carbon that's completely different, wie der Carbon eitzim was steht bei Zman Atzia Kainim Va'am. Then this carbon eitzim that it says here that these families donated in these designated times the wood to the Mizbeach. What's the difference? In Teiris Kainim, retzich wegen a carbon eitzim. The Teiris Kainim is actually speaking about a carbon. You're donating wood to be as a carbon on the Mizbeach, similar to any other carbon that you donate to sacrifice in the Mizbeach. So here, the wood itself is a carbon. And for hayachid, that has to be from an individual. Wie the lashon in Teiris Kainim, hayachid misnadev, that only an individual can bring the carbon. Was man is makriv als carbon auf dem Mizbeach, which will be sacrificed on the Mizbeach as a carbon. In other words, it's not going to be used as firewood for the fire to burn karbanis on the Mizbeach, but it itself will be a carbon that's sacrificed on the Mizbeach like every other carbon. One of them is gesagt geworden der din, and regarding this, there's the limitation, there's the halacha, as mekanis not bringen b'shutfis, that it can't be brought in partnership. Aber, on the other hand though, zman atzia kainim va'am chulu, these designated time periods when these families donated wood for the Mizbeach von die Test Mishpachis, these 9 families, retnet wegen eitzim, was mot menadev gewen, sei guf als carbon. It's not speaking about wood that is being donated, that it itself should become a carbon on the Mizbeach. Nor wegen eitzim l'maracha. What it's speaking about is that they donated wood to be used for the maracha, for those fires that are set up on the Mizbeach, that they're going to place these woods, like it said there in the Gemara, even when they had enough wood in the chamber, and nevertheless these families came and brought wood, they took their wood that they donated at this time, and they placed it on the Mizbeach to be there for the firewood to burn the karbanis. Eitzim l'maracha, meaning it's not a carbon which is being sacrificed on the Mizbeach like every carbon. It's wood being donated to be part of the firewood on the Mizbeach. Wie steht in the Braisa, as quoted before of what it says in the Braisa in the Gemara, Kanal, that Kisha'olu b'nei ha'goyla, le'motzu eitzim b'lishka chulu, that the point is that they did not find any wood in the chamber where they had the wood. Kakosov b'teire, like it says in the Teire, that you have to burn the karbonis on the wood on the Mizbeach. So das heißt, what do we understand from that Braisa? The eitzim was megedarft from Mizbeach, the wood that was needed on the Mizbeach. So this is not wood that's being brought as a carbon for itself, but this is the wood, the firewood, that to be able to make a fire on the Mizbeach. Und die Eitzim können gebracht werden euch b'shutfis. This donation of wood for the firewood of the Mizbeach, and not as a carbon for itself, that could be brought in partnership. Und befragt, als man sich sei wie gedarft übergeben zum Zibur. Especially when it comes to this wood that's used as firewood on the Mizbeach, that's not something that's allowed to be privately owned. Like everything else in the Beis HaMikdash, that when you donate and it becomes a keli in the Beis HaMikdash, it has to belong to the tzibur that's being used for everything that's done, for the Aveda done in the Beis HaMikdash. Firewood donated to the Beis HaMikdash is not an individually owned thing that now is kachim. It has to be given away to the Beis HaMikdash, that it belongs now to the tzibur brought in the Mizbeach. So for sure this is something that can be brought b'shutfis, in partnership, because it's not even going to be individually owned when it's placed on the Mizbeach. It's going to be given away to the tzibur to be there as firewood on the Mizbeach. So these are 2 totally different things. There's the carbon eitzim that an individual brings as an actual carbon for itself, and then there's the carbon that these families, or the eitzim rather, that these families donated as firewood for the Mizbeach. But this distinction is not so simple. The Rabbi here will point out that we see that the carbon that a yachid brings from wood and the eitzim that these families brought and donated to the Beis HaMikdash are very closely tied together. They are similar. However, this needs an additional explanation here. Varum, because regarding to this halacha that a person can donate wood as a carbon, an individual can donate wood as a carbon. So the Gemara brings an argument regarding the nature of this carbon. Carbon, this extra word carbon, when it says in the nefesh ki sakriv carbon mincha, teaches me that you can bring wood as a carbon. Then the Braisa there continues and says, where do I see that there's a concept called carbon eitzim? How do I know that eitzim is b'chlal called a carbon? It's an extra word carbon, but maybe that refers only to other things, other components of the carbon, yayin or shemen or levina that come together with the carbon. How do we know that wood itself is considered to be a carbon? So he brings from the donations of these families. Like it says that they made a lottery to designate the times when they brought carbon eitzim. So from there we see that eitzim is also a carbon. So that's the Tanakama here in this Braisa, the Rabbanon. So they say that you can bring wood as a carbon. And you bring the wood itself as a carbon, and that's it. Rabbi takes this a step further. Rabbi says, eitzim, carbon name. The eight is this wood itself is a carbon, and therefore, tunin melach, tunin agosha, they're no different than any other carbon which needs salt. Every carbon has to be salted. So these eitzim is considered to be like a carbon for itself. It's not just firewood. So you have to salt it as well. And tunin agosha, it also has to be brought like a carbon mincha before it's placed on the mizbeach. You bring the bowl of the flour and the oil and you bring it close to the mizbeach. So it's the same with this wood. It has to be brought close to the mizbeach, touched to the mizbeach, and then you place it onto the mizbeach. And if them is the Gemara Mamshach, the Gemara goes even further. Omar Rava, that Rava adds a divrei Rabbi eitzim tu'unin kemitze. Just like you find by carbon mincha, there's a halacha of kemitze where you take off from the top with your fingers to burn on the mizbeach. So by this wood as well, you have to do a kemitze, just like a carbon mincha. And then Omar Rav Papa, le divrei Rabbi eitzim tzrichem eitzim. Just like every carbon, there's the carbon that's being burnt on the mizbeach, and there's the firewood that the carbon is being burnt on. You don't make the fire just in the pieces of the carbon itself, but there has to be firewood there for the carbon. So too over here, the wood, which is a carbon, also needs other eitzim, which is going to be the firewood for this carbon, which is the wood itself. So what we see over here is 2 points. First of all, there's a machlekes between Rabbi and the Rabbanon to what extent we treat this carbon eitzim like a carbon. Rabbi takes it very far that it's mamish, all the halachas of carbon mincha apply to it, whereas the Rabbanan don't say no. We don't apply all these details like a carbon mincha itself. It's just wood that's placed on the mizbeach. But the other detail we see over here is, it's talking about this carbon that a yachid is menadev, the carbon eitzim that an individual brings, and what's the source that it's bringing, the Tanakama? He's bringing the source that eitzim is called a carbon from these eitzim that the families brought to the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore the question is mimanavshach? If so, either way we look at this, there's a problem here, there's a question here. Oib, if, as it seems here from this lashon of the Braisa, as v'hagirol is a pal nar carbon eitzim, those geirolos that they made for the carbon eitzim that the families brought when they donated the wood to the mizbeach is the zelbe inyan videdin from misnadvim eitzim. It's the exact same thing as the eitzim that we learn from the pasuk that an individual could bring a carbon to the mizbeach. That's what it seems like. The Braisa puts it together. And actually, this idea that the carbon that an individual could bring of eitzim, and the fact that the families brought this carbon eitzim in that time period in the second Beis HaMikdash, that they go together, that they're similar, we could see this from the language of the Tosefta. What does the Tosefta say? Ma ro zman atzi akayinim v'ha'am li'imonis. What is the point of these designated times that these families of Kainim and the Yidden, they counted and they made these specific times that they brought the carbon? That's the question that the Tosefta asks. Now, what exactly is that question? So the Rebbe explains here. What the Shaila is, as the Mefarshim say, the question that Tosefta is asking is, anybody could decide to donate wood as a carbon whenever he wishes. So what's unique about these families, these 9 families, that they have a designated time when they donate wood as a carbon? Anybody could. That's the question that the Tosefta asks. Is doch mochach l'chayre, so this itself is clear, as das is the zelbe inyan, that he's equating them. He's asking what's unique about the mishpachas that bring these eitzim, if anybody could donate as a carbon. So they're the same, in other words. So the question comes back to what we asked before in the beginning, is how could this carbon eitzim be brought in partnership? How are these families bringing carbon eitzim? The distinction that I've made before, that the families only brought them as firewood, and the individual that brings it is bringing it as a real carbon. It seems to be not true here. The Braisa here puts them together. The carbon that an individual brings and the V'hagirolis Epalno al carbon eitzim, which is the pasuk speaking about the families, goes together. So how could it be brought in partnership? And if you'll argue and say that maybe only according to Rabbi, that takes this all the way literally to that we treat it exactly like a carbon mincha, and all the details of a carbon mincha apply to a carbon eitzim. So therefore only Rabbi's opinion is that the carbon eitzim is exactly a carbon. It's a real carbon, and also the carbon of the families that they brought is a real carbon. But maybe according to the Rabbanon, it's not the same thing. And the carbon of the families are not a regular carbon, it's just wood that's brought as firewood. So then the question would be, is Vasadarayif and Vayikra Palno are carbon eitzim? So how could the Braisa compare it? How could the Rabbanon bring a proof to the fact that wood is considered to be a carbon from the pasuk where it speaks about the eitzim of the families? Zum Inyan was a yachid kemenadav sein eitzim als a carbon. And he's connecting it, he's bringing this as a raya to a yachid that can bring wood. If the distinction that Rabbi said before is true, that the carbon of the families is just a donation of firewood, and the carbon of eitzim that we're speaking about here is a real carbon for itself, so why is the Braisa bringing in a raya of agirolis of palma carbon eitzim that proves that wood itself is a carbon? That's just firewood, it's a different story. So, the point is, we clearly see from this Braisa that these two carbonos are similar. The carbon eitzim that any individual could bring and the carbon eitzim that the families brought are the same concept of carbon eitzim, wood that's being brought as a carbon. If so, the question is, how could a carbon be brought b'shutvis? How are these families bringing this carbon eitzim? In addition, we also should explain here this machlokes between Rabbi and the Rabbanon. What's the time of machlokes from Rabbi and Rabbanon? What's the explanation of the machlokes here regarding this carbon eitzim, whether it's just brought as wood and placed on the mizbeach, or all the halachas of carbon mincha applied to it, as Rabbi says? The bepashtos, so seemingly, simply, aside the Rabbanon, aside Rabbi, learning the sarais from carbon mincha, they both learn out the halacha of carbon eitzim from the extra word that it says by carbon mincha, so it's compared to a mincha. On oich Rabbi, but Rabbi as well is pasik al carbon eitzim. The source that eitzim could be included in this word carbon that it says by mincha is only learned out from this that we find in another place where the Torah uses the term carbon eitzim. Was von dem pasik darf gewesen as eitzim werden angerufen carbon. That wood is considered to be a carbon. Or b'meile kamen from carbon mincha marbe sein eitzim. And therefore you could say that when it uses the extra word carbon by carbon mincha, that refers to wood as well, because I see that wood is also considered to be a carbon. So this is, everybody agrees to this. That the source is from the extra word carbon, and from V'hagirolis Epalna carbon eitzim is the source that it's called carbon eitzim. So what exactly is the basis of the machlokes, whether I go all the way and compare it to a carbon mincha, or not, or it's just brought as wood on the mizbeach? Al pi anal, based on what we've explained over here, is move on, it's also understood. As mekanet verenfering kushya anal sifalef, we can't answer the question here of how is it possible that these families are bringing carbon eitzim in partnership. Al pidem was the mefarshim learn and according to this that some mefarshim say, as das was nidvas eitzim, can it come in b'shutfis, this halacha that it says in the Teres Kainim, that a carbon eitzim cannot be brought in partnership, is nor let the man Amar was halt. This is dependent on a machlokes. And this is only according to one opinion which says was halt as the din from misnadvim levayna yayin v'shemen ve'eitzim, that the individual could bring one of these components of the carbon itself as a carbon, learn it up from carbon. You learn it from this extra word of carbon that it says by mincha, was steht by mincha, and therefore from there we learn kishem shein shnayim eviin minchas nedava. It's just like two partners cannot bring a carbon mincha as a donation. So too they can't bring wine or levaina or wood as a carbon in partnership. So it's only if the source of this carbon of eitzim comes from the pasuk, the extra word carbon that it says by mincha. However, loit the mandama was ladent up. as meken menadav zayin yayin v'shemen. Another opinion says that from where do we know that an individual could bring just wine or oil separately as a donation for a carbon? From Pasuk Ezrach, there's an extra word Ezrach that it says by the Nesachim, was steht by Nesachim, zene ze nit gleich zu mincha. So therefore there's no reason to compare this donation of the wine and the oil that's brought separately to the carbon mincha. It's not learned out from the Pasuk that it says by carbon mincha. O meken ze bringen mishutfis. And therefore it could be brought in partnership. And therefore maybe we'll say that the same thing applies to wood as well, that wood is not learned necessarily from the word carbon that it says by mincha. Maybe according to this opinion, it's learned from the pasuk that it says Ezrach by Nesachim. So therefore it can be brought in partnership, and it's according to that opinion that the families brought the carbon together. So the Rebbe says this is not an answer. The mid vertach nit verämpft die kushianal. This, however, does not answer our question, because ha niche yayim v'shemen. This point, this distinction, whether you learn it out from the carbon mincha, the extra word carbon that it says by mincha, or you learn it out from the extra word ezrach that it says by nesachim, that will only be a difference regarding wine and oil. Aber, however, regarding eitzim, this is not an answer, because Aleph, number one, v'hagirolei sepalno al carbon eitzim v'gaimer. This that it says, the pasuk, that there were these families that brought the carbon eitzim in partnership, is doch a pasuk was darf stimmen letale days. This is a pasuk that everybody agrees to. There's no argument about this, that the families brought this carbon eitzim together. So this has to be true according to all opinions. Euch leute man dama was halt as eitzim kumenit beshutfis. Also according to the opinion that says that wood cannot be brought in partnership. We can't say there's a machlokes about this, whether you learn it from the word carbon that it says by mincha, or the word nesachim, or the word ezrach that it says by nesachim. Everybody has to agree, even the opinion that says that you learn it from carbon, and from there we see that it cannot be brought in partnership, but nevertheless, for some reason, when it came to these families bringing the carbon eitzim, there's a clear pasuk. The pasuk says that the families did bring it in partnership. So that still has to be answered according to that man Amar. Beis, another point over here is das was in the Gemara is das svara. This whole entire thing that we just mentioned here, that there is a svara, there is an opinion that says as misnadven shemen, that one could bring oil separately as a carbon. Vert abgelernt leit ein man da Amar. According to one opinion, this is learned out from the Ezrach, from the word Ezrach, was steht by Nesachim, that it says by Nesachim and not by Mincha. And therefore you may say that the limitation of it not being brought in partnership does not apply, is das dafke das Rabbi. The Gemara there says this is according to whose opinion? According to Rabbi. The Gemara there says, but according to the Rabbanon, is Pashut L'Kula Alma. Everybody would agree as melerent us up from carbon mincha, that the carbon that could be brought from shemen, yayin, or eitzim alone, it definitely is learned out from carbon mincha. So it's Rabbi the one that maybe learns it out from the word ezrach that it says by nesachim. On ledas Rabbi, the Gemara there also says that according to Rabbi's opinion, dem carbon eitzim b'shutfis. It cannot be brought b'shutfis v'balt as you haben dem din von a carbon mincha. Even according to this svara that says that you learn it out from Ezrach, but the Gemara there says Rabbi's opinion still is, like we saw before what Rabbi said, that the carbon eitzim is treated exactly like a carbon mincha, with all the details of a carbon mincha, the salt, the hagosha, the kmitze. So Rabbi holds that it's exactly like a carbon mincha. Was the riber is tun melach, tun hagosha, and kmitze, punkt via carbon mincha. So according to Rabbi, either way, whatever the source is, carbon eitzim has the halacha of a carbon mincha that it cannot be brought b'shutfis. If so, our original question still remains a question. How is it that these families brought the carbon eitzim b'shutfis, the families together? So to explain this, to answer this question, the Rebbe will first explain the families, that the families came and brought their carbon eitzim. Let's have a better understanding of what this carbon eitzim that these families donated to the Beis HaMikdash is. In Asbaras HaTeichen von dem carbon eitzim b'Mesechta Tainis, regarding this carbon eitzim that the families brought, which the Gemara explains in the end of Tainis, gefindt men kamedeis, we find a few opinions about this. In Pirish HaMishnayis, sagt der Rambam, so the Rambam writes in his Pirish HaMishnayis, as in dem Tag was the Mishpachas haben gebracht eitzim leisha maracha. On the day that they donated this wood for the fire on the Mizbeach, hoyu makrivin karbonis nedava. Along with the wood, they brought also an animal as a carbon, as a donation for a carbon. V'zehu carbon eitzim, and it's this donation of an animal as a carbon that's referred to as the carbon of the wood. And v'ha'itim amuzumanim, there were designated times, haksuvim be'ezra, which it says in the pasuk in Ezra. So what we see over here in the Rambam is that carbon eitzim means that there were the eitzim that they brought as a donation for the firewood on the Mizbeach, and along with it, these families brought also a carbon oilas nadava. On bepratius, more specified in Sefer Hayad, Zok the Rambam says this in Sefer Hayad. Carbon eitzim. What is this carbon eitzim that the families brought? Zman kavua hayol mishpachis. There was a designated time for these families. Mishpachis. Lotzes liyarim. They went out into the forests to cut wood. Lahavi eitzim lemaracha, to bring wood for the fire on the mizbeach. And the yom sheyagil ibnei mishpacha zu lahavi eitzim, the day that arrives for this family to bring their wood. Hoy makrivin oilis nedava. Along with the wood, they brought a carbon oila. V'zehu carbon eitzim. That is the carbon eitzim, this carbon oil that they brought together with the wood. V'haya lahem k'ma yontif. And this day for this family was like a yontif. V'asurim b'y behesped v'tainis. No eulogy, no fasting on this day. Basiyas malacha, and even not to do any work on this day. V'davaz minig, and this is the custom. So the Rambam here is saying as follows. The Rabbi explains what we see from this Rambam. Das haste. As carbon eitzim meant nita carbon fun eitzim. The carbon eitzim does not mean that the wood itself is the carbon that's brought on the mizbeach. The wood is being donated as firewood for the fire on the mizbeach. Not as in imzman v'zeh gebracht the eitzim l'maracha. When these families had the designated times that they brought wood for the firewood on the mizbeach, hamazeh gebracht oiles nedave. They brought along with this firewood on the mizbeach also a carbon oil as a donation. Und die Eiles werden angerufen carbon eitzim, because these Eiles that they brought from animals that were brought together with the wood that they donated, so therefore it got the name carbon eitzim. Dem carbon von Eiles nedave was hat mat gebracht b'yoyim avos eitzim. It's the carbon that they brought as a donation on that day that they brought the wood, until libde eitzim, or also because of the wood that they brought then as a donation for the maracha on the mizbeach. So that's the meaning of carbon eitzim. The eitzim itself is not the carbon. It's the carbon oila that's really the carbon. The eitzim is just for the firewood on the mizbeach. That's the Rambam's description of this halacha of carbon eitzim that the families brought. The Ritva is masbir, however, the Ritva explains differently. Shahayu mevarem b'mizbeach b'fnei atzmai mina eitzim. They donated wood, and then they would burn this wood separately on the mizbeach as a carbon. Shehes rabu or shehes nadvu, that they had a lot of this wood, or that they donated from this wood. V'zeh haya carbon eitzim. This itself is the carbon eitzim. In other words, the wood that they brought was not firewood, and they didn't bring another carbon of a behemoth along with the wood, like the Rambam says. The wood itself is the carbon. This is like it says that we find that the wood itself is burnt on the mizbeach. Sheshnei gizarin hayu carbon kreven, that is im tamat shel bein arbayim. They brought 2 logs of wood, even though there was enough wood on the mizbeach and there was a fire burning there. There were additional 2 logs of wood that had to be brought every day together with the carbon tamat shel bein arbayim to burn on the mizbeach together with the carbon. This itself proves to you ki carbon eitzim mamishu, that you have such a concept that the wood itself is not there as firewood, but that there are logs of wood that have to be burnt on the mizbeach at the time of the carbon tamid as a carbon for itself. And so too, these families that donated the carbon eitzim to the Beis Hamikdash, the carbon eitzim was simply a carbon from wood, not just a donation of wood for the firewood for the maracha on the mizbeach. At the Ritva's Pshat. Now, what does Rashi say? So Rashi is not so clear. Rashi is mefarish in the Mishnah. So there in the Mishnah that speaks about this carbon eitzim, Rashi says, as in them tog was the kayanim va'am is nadum lavi eitzim. On this day that they donated to bring the wood. Again, va'im carbon oisayim, and they brought a carbon on that day. Even if there was already a lot of wood there. These families brought and donated the carbon eitzim in these times, in these 9 time periods. So from Pirish Rashi's mashma l'chayre, it would seem from what Rashi says, vidas Rambam in them, like the Rambam's opinion, as nit the eitzim zene given their carbon, the wood itself was not the carbon, the wood they donated for the firewood, nor mat makriv given a bazunde carbon in zusammenhang mit the eitzim. They brought another carbon, which would be a oilas nedava, similar to like the Rambam says, together with the wood. The Lashon of Rashi is that misnadvim lahavi eitzim, and then Rashi says vehayu makrivin carbon. It seems like the V'hayu is not from this wood. V'hayu is a separate thing, that they brought a carbon together with the wood that they brought. We see this also from Rashi's language in a different place. They had these mishpachas that had those days that were every year. So Rashi clearly says that they brought the wood to the Beis HaMikdash for what purpose? Like the Rambam says, it was firewood for the Mizbeach. And then there's a carbon eitzim that they brought along with the wood. So it seems like that this carbon eitzim is not from the wood itself. That's an additional carbon, like the Rambam says, that they brought with the firewood. But the thing is, Rashi is aber nit mefarish, wie das tut der Rambam. Rashi does not explain like the Rambam does. Was für a carbon hat demult gebracht? So what is this additional carbon that they brought together with the carbon eitzim? The Rambam spells out specifically. It was a oilus nedava. But Rashi does not say. Rashi just says, umevi'in carbon eitzim imon. What was this? So we have over here the Rambam, the Ritva, and Rashi. So on each one of them, the Rebbe has a question that we have to clarify here. Darfum verstehen, the question is, Aleph ledas Rambam and Oich ledas Rashi. According to the Rambam, and presumably if Rashi agrees to the Rambam, from where do we know this? As carbon eitzim, meitnit kipshutai. Why are we not learning this literally, that carbon eitzim means that the wood itself is a carbon? And that is what the families donated as a carbon. We don't, so the Rambam says it does not mean that the carbon was the wood itself, nor a carbon silib nidvus eitzim. Rather, they brought a carbon oila from an animal along with the eitzim. Megefintach as the eitzim lemaracha werden angerufen carbon. We find that even the wood that was placed on the maracha of the Mizbeach is also called a carbon. Wie der Rambam allein sagt es b'mefurish. And the Rambam himself says this regarding the halacha, going back to the beginning, the fact that a yachid could donate eitzim, that there is a halacha that a person can bring yayin, levayna, shemen, and eitzim as a carbon. The Rambam brings this b'mefurish in Hilchas Ma'is HaKarbanis. So if the Rambam himself brings this concept that a yachid could be makriv eitzim as a carbon, so why over here when it comes to these families that are bringing the carbon from the eitzim, does the Rambam say that it's not the eitzim itself which is a carbon? There's an oilus nadava brought along with the eitzim which is the carbon. Beis, lidach gise. Now, on the other hand, the question is according to the Ritva. The Ritva is the eitzim, allein zene given a carbon with Mizbeach. The Ritva says that it's the wood itself which was the actual carbon on the Mizbeach. Tzarechien. So there's the following thing that has to be explained. It clearly says as the eitzim hat man gebracht, that why were these eitzim donated to the Beis HaMikdash? So as we quoted before the lashon of the Braise, they did not have enough wood in the chamber when they came up to the second Beis HaMikdash. And these families came and donated from their wood. And therefore the Nevi'im made a condition for future generations that they should have the opportunity to always donate wood to the Beis HaMikdash for this purpose. So wie bald, if so, since as die Sibbe von the Nidves Eitzim is given, das was is nicht given, ken Eitzim Maracha, they were missing the wood in the chamber that's used for the Maracha, for the fire on the Mizbeach, for the firewood, darf man doch sagen, as in dem is bestanden, dem is nadim shalahem. So shouldn't we say that the Nedava that they brought was simply for this purpose, for the Maracha, for the fire? What is the reason that the Ritva says that the wood itself is an actual carbon? Why should it be an actual carbon? The point of their Nedava was for the firewood of the Mizbeach. And Gimel Das Rashi, now it has to be clarified, according to Rashi's opinion is, was fara carbon hot me makriv given auf Mizbeach. Rashi seems to be saying that there's the wood that they brought for the Marache, but then with this they also brought a carbon. Carbon eitzim. And Rashi does not say what that carbon eitzim is. So that has to be clarified. What exactly is Rashi's opinion? What is this carbon that they brought? So to explain this carbon eitzim, which is what the families brought, the Rebbe will now go back to the halacha of carbon eitzim that any individual could donate as a carbon. As we already saw towards the beginning, that these two karbanis are not really separate from each other. They're linked. They're similar to each other. We saw in the lashon of the Gemara and the Braise, where it talks about the din of misnadvim eitzim, and there the Braise itself brings the pasuk v'hagerolis hipalno al carbon eitzim, which is the carbon that the families brought. They go together. So to understand better the source of the Rambam and the Ritva and the Rashi regarding this carbon eitzim that the families brought, we have to go back again to see the halacha regarding the individual that donates a carbon eitzim. So the bir bezeh, to explain the opinions regarding the carbon eitzim of the families. So here, let's go back to the machlokes of Rabbi and the Rabbanon regarding the carbon of eitzim that an individual donates. L'das Rabbanon was lernen up from carbon. the Rabbanan learn out from the word carbon that melamed shemisnadven eitzim, that this teaches me that you can donate wood to the Mizbeach. Gefitmen bechlalos zwei shittas b'negeya dem din v'geder von eitzim. So there are two opinions that Rishonim say regarding what Rabbanan's opinion is regarding this wood that could be brought as a carbon. Rabbeinu Gershom says, v'kasavar Tanakama, the Tanakama holds, the oisang gzirin kreven lehechsher karbonis al maracha. That the Rabbanan's opinion is that it's not actually a carbon at all for itself. These woods that could be brought as a carbon, what kind of a carbon is this? It's a carbon that's being brought as part of the firewood on the Mizbeach that's used to burn the karbonis that are going to be sacrificed in the Mizbeach. And that's the reason why the Rabbanan say that the carbon eitzim does not have all the details of the halachas of a regular carbon mincha, whether it's the kmitze or the hagasha or so on, because it's only being used as a carbon eitzim for the maracha, for the firewood of the Mizbeach. That's the basis of the argument between the Rabbi and the Rabbanan. Rabbi says it's a real carbon, and the Rabbanan say no, it's only wood for the maracha on the Mizbeach. It seems that this is also the Rambam's opinion in Pirush HaMishnayos, where the Rambam says, that you have to bring an additional 2 logs that they brought every morning and also actually every afternoon on the Mizbeach. Nothing less than this. So from the term Neisafim, you see that the Rambam says that there's the logs of wood that are there on the Mizbeach. And what is their purpose? As firewood, for the fire on the Mizbeach. And these woods that are added on the Mizbeach is being added to those firewoods, not as a carbon for itself, but as firewood. And the Rambam is saying that this is the concept, according to the Rabbanon, of what this carbon is about. It's being brought as firewood on the Mizbeach. The Ravid Abahalt, however, the Ravid's opinion is, as Ladas Rabbanon, hat man die Eitzim makir gewen b'fnei atzmai. The Rabbanan say that the wood is brought on the Mizbeach separately. It is brought as a carbon for itself, similar to what Rabbi says, that it's brought as a carbon for itself and not simply as firewood. The Rabbanan agreed to that. So what's their argument? Says Abamuvan as oich l'shittas ha'Ravid, but it's understood that even according to the Ravid, Muzman Zogin, as the Eitzim zen lefi das Rabbanan nit ken carbon gomor vile das Rabbi. However, even the Ravid will agree that the Eitzim is not a carbon in its fullest sense, like according to Rabbi's opinion. As we see, the Rabbanan say that you just place the wood on the Mizbeach, and Rabbi says, no, you have to do all the different halachas with it like a regular carbon. So these are the two opinions in the Rishonim over here. Regarding the carbon eitzim, in the Rabbanan's opinion, is it a carbon eitzim, like the Ravid says, even if not a carbon gomor, but it's a carbon eitzim, or it's just the carbon eitzim, according to the Rabbanan, is firewood for the maracha of the Mizbeach. That's what the whole gather of this carbon is, and that's why it doesn't have the halachas of a regular carbon. Now the explanation, the source of this machlokes of Rabbi and the Rabbanon is as follows. Yeshloimar, as in the machlokes between Rabbi and the Rabbanon, this argument between Rabbi and the Rabbanon, they have a certain opinion which they have here and in other places. Was megefint bekame mekaimis in the machlokes from Rabbi ubar plukte, where we find that Rabbi and the ones that argue with him, ubefrat mit Rabbanon, when you have Rabbi that argues in a Braisa or in a Mishnah with Rabbanon, so there's a certain approach in this argument that we find in many places, and that is as follows. A lashon in the Torah, oder in divrei Chazal, weil derech ze belashon b'nei Adam kedlekamon, a language that's used in the pasuk in the Torah, or even in Chazal in a Mishnah, or even in the language the way people speak, as the Rebbe will bring soon examples for this. Tzidas vet getayt dafke kipshutei mamish. Do we translate this literally and beis ubechol pratim with all the details as is in the way it's explained literally with the details? Other das kan meinen not a tail, or we translate it, we explain it partially, or that in ein prat, it's only one detail of this word, the meaning is not to the fullest extent. That's what they're arguing about. Ubenidin di don. Over here, regarding this concept of carbon ha'etzim, how literal does this chiddush and this drasha that we learn from the pasuk, that there's a new concept called carbon ha'etzim go? How far does this go? The Das Rabbi, according to Rabbi's opinion, we learned up from carbon mincha. As eitzim mikri carbon, the word carbon mincha, the extra word teaches me that even eitzim are also called a carbon. On misnadven eitzim, you could donate wood itself as a carbon. Ubefrat as megefint pasik carbon ha'eitzim. The pasuk of Hagirolis Hepalno, over there, the Torah actually uses the term carbon eitzim, zakmen kipshutai. So therefore, this has to be understood literally as the eitzim alein zenena carbon. The wood itself is a carbon. It's not just there as a hechsher for a carbon, for the marache, for the firewood to burn a carbon, but it itself is a carbon. Und as haben dem din carbon b'chol pratim. And we apply all the details, all the halachas that we have by a regular carbon mincha will apply over here to this carbon as well. Und the Rebbe lernt the Rebbe as the eitzim davon haben, melach, hagasha, v'chulu, all the details of the halachas apply, alle pratim via carbon mincha. Kipshutai, literally. That's Rebbe's approach, to translate the meaning of the word literally. However, the Rabbanan's opinion is, yes, we learn out from this extra word carbon that you can bring eitzim as a carbon. Und the pasuk ruft zu young carbon eitzim. The pasuk refers to it as the carbon eitzim. Is das nit machriach a chiddush gadol? However, we don't go so far to say such a big chiddush as eitzim zenen a carbon or b'chol apratim, that the wood itself, which is usually just used as firewood, becomes like a regular carbon with all of the details like you find by a regular carbon. Nor eitzim mechadish zayin. According to the Rabbanan, it's sufficient to say that the extra word carbon teaches me as a farmagin ein prat von a carbon, that this has a certain detail of a carbon. Ze werden verbrennte from Mizbeach via carbon. It's burnt on the Mizbeach like a carbon. That would be according to the opinion of Rabbeinu Gershon, that it's actually a hechsher carbon. It's just being used as firewood, but it is burnt on the Mizbeach like a carbon when you donate this carbon eitzim. It's not firewood, but it's actually brought as a carbon on the Mizbeach, but it's still not a carbon gomer, because it doesn't have all the halachas that apply to a carbon mincha by it. So it's also a carbon, but not to the fullest extent, b'chol apratim. So that's the general approach of the Rabbanan, that there's a chiddush here to apply the term carbon to eitzim, but we don't have to take it literally and with all of the details. That's the machlokes between Rabbi and the Rabbanan. Okay, but the point over here is that Rabbanan's opinion is that this carbon eitzim is not a full-fledged carbon. Or possibly it's only even a hechsher carbon. It's really considered to be firewood that is being donated to the Mizbeach. So now, after we understand what the Rabbanan's opinion regarding a carbon is by the carbon eitzim that the Torah is mechadish that an individual could donate, this will also explain to us when it comes to the carbon eitzim that the families brought as donations to the Beis HaMikdash. So the Rebbe is going to begin first with the shit of the Rambam. So what was the question the Rebbe asked before? From where did the Rambam take to say that the carbon eitzim that the families brought is not that the eitzim themselves were a carbon, but rather the eitzim that they donated was for the maracha, for the firewood? And what does the term carbon eitzim mean? That there was an additional carbon oila that they brought as an adava together with the eitzim, and that's the carbon eitzim. Where did the Rambam take this from? So the point is as follows. Vibal, the Rambam paskin vid Rabbanon. Since the Rambam paskins like the Rabbanan's opinion, as a film is ozagan as the eitzim alein brengt men of Mizbeach kedas harayvid, even if, according to the Rabbanan, even if we'll interpret the opinion of the Rabbanan like the Ravid's interpretation, that it's brought separately on the Mizbeach as a carbon, and not just as a hechsher, as the firewood for the maracha, but it itself is being sacrificed as a carbon, but since this is not considered to be on the level of a regular carbon, it's just placed on the mizbeach without any of the all the halachas that usually apply by a carbon. So it's a carbon which is sort of a compromised carbon, so to speak. It's on a much lower level than a regular carbon. Is nit mistave. So the Rambam holds it wouldn't be logical to say, as to leave them, for such a kind of a carbon, bringing a carbon a eitzim, these families donated wood as a carbon on the Mizbeach. And what kind of a carbon is this? Like we see regarding the halacha, that eitzim could be a carbon, that this is not even a regular carbon. So it doesn't make sense to say that because of this, zol der tag sein kemo yomtiv, nevasurim bay, behesped, ubetainis, that this is going to become into a whole yomtiv for this family. And it's, you're not allowed to do a hesped and a tainus and no malacha and so on. The carbon that they're bringing is a lower level of a carbon than any regular carbon that you bring as an adava. So why would this be such a unique and special carbon that they make a whole yomtiv out of this? Befrat, to take this even a step further, as we mentioned before, befrat noch, as visis mashma, halte Rambam, as das was misnadvim eitzim meint nor lemaracha. This whole halacha that an individual could bring wood as a carbon is only being brought not even as a carbon for itself. it's being brought as a carbon that's going to be used as firewood on the Mizbeach. Und euch das ist maspik auf Zerufin ze carbon. And the chiddush of the Rabbanan is that although it's only firewood, and you would think that if it's firewood, it's just a hechsher carbon, but nevertheless, the Torah gives it the label it refers to with the term carbon. But in essence, what is it? It's firewood. Is the Chavad schwer zu sagen, so most definitely it would be difficult to say, as the Nidvas Eitzim Lamarache is das Gewinn, the carbon Eitzim from the Testmishpachis, that when these families brought carbon ha'eitzim. What is this special carbon ha'eitzim? It's this firewood. Nasalibdem zol the tag zayin kama yontiv asurim by best with the betainis, and because of this firewood, the day should be a yontiv and no eulogy on this day. It's very difficult to say that it goes so far. Why? The eitzim zenadach nora hechsher carbon. The wood is just a hechsher. It's enabling it's a firewood to burn the carbonis on the mizbeach. And another important point here is what has to be done with the firewood that you donate to the mizbeach. It has to be donated to become public ownership. It has to belong to the Beis HaMikdash, to the tzibur, to be used to burn the carbonis on the mizbeach. So if so, Heinz Vikem Zogen at Selibdem soll sein Kimayamte Vasurim by Behesper the Betainis by der Mishpacha. So why would this be a sufficient reason that this family should turn it into their own private celebration if it's not even a regular carbon, and it's carbon that becomes part of the firewood in the Beis HaMikdash that belongs to everybody, it belongs to the Tzibur. The little bit learned the Rambam. So this is the reason why the Rambam comes up with his chiddush and says, as v'yom she'yagia l'bnei mishpacha zula v'yaitzim, that the day that arrived when this family brought their donations of the wood to the Beis HaMikdash, hayem akrivin oilis nedava. They brought along with this also an oilis nedava and v'zehu carbon eitzim. And that is what we refer to as the carbon eitzim. Umehai taime, and this is the reason that hoyalem kama yomtiv asurim by be'esper the betainis basiyas malacha, that there was a yomtiv and no eulogy and no malacha mitzad the oilis nedava. But then a carbon gomer, because along with this wood, there was a regular oilis nedava that they brought as a carbon, a real carbon that was brought here. So this was a carbon that was brought with this special donation that they brought for carbon eitzim, and that turned it into a whole yomtiv, into a whole celebration. But if it was just the wood itself, which turns out to be just firewood and it belongs to the tzibur, that would not be enough of a reason to make such a celebration for this specific family. Okay, so we understand the Rambam's opinion, and it's connected to the Rabbanan. It's based on the Rabbanan that say that the whole concept of bringing carbon eitzim as a carbon doesn't really mean that the carbon eitzim becomes a carbon for itself. The carbon eitzim that's donated as a carbon becomes part of the marocha on the mizbeach, the firewood. Elamite is also called a carbon. That's the chiddush of the Torah. And therefore, b'negeh to the carbon eitzim that the families brought, we must say that there was another oilas nadava that they brought together. Und es ist kein Kashinit, was sagt carbon eitzim leit in Rambam. Again, es ist kein Kashinit, was sagt carbon eitzim leit in Rambam, angerufen carbon eitzim. The fact that this carbon eitzim is referred to with such a name as carbon eitzim, even though it's not the carbon that was from the wood itself. The carbon was the oilis nadav, chachas nit the eitzim allein zijn the carbon. So why is that not a question? Warum wie bald as the Rambam paskind wie the chachamim the Rabbi kana? The Rambam is paskind like the chachamim that argue with Rabbi, as me ken teitschen euch nit kipshute mamish. That when it says in the Torah, the chiddush, that eitzim is a carbon, it doesn't have to be literally with all the details. It means that the eitzim is a carbon to some extent. It's really eitzim l'maracha, according to the Rambam. But nevertheless, we refer to it as a carbon. Al derech zayich by carbon eitzim. So similar also over here regarding the carbon eitzim that the families brought. Meintes nit kipshuta. It doesn't mean that the wood itself is a carbon eitzim, because it's not. Eitzim als carbon. Nor oilois nedave ves kumen zusammen zu liebe eitzim. Rather, what it's referring to is the oilois, the carbon oilois nedave that was brought together with the wood, and that is the carbon eitzim. That's the Rambam's approach. Well, that's a Rambam. So now, coming back to the first question that was asked here in the Siche, so we understand, obviously, that according to the Rambam, that question doesn't begin b'chlal. What was the question? That we find that it says that a carbon eitzim cannot be brought b'shutfis, cannot be brought in partnership. So the question is, how did these families bring the carbon eitzim b'shutfis? So according to the Rambam, this question doesn't begin b'chlal. The fact that these 9 families brought these eitzim in partnership is not a problem. Waren die eitzim sind doch gewähnt nar l'marache. these eitzim are not being brought as a carbon for itself. It's being brought as a carbon, which what happens to it? It becomes part of the marach and the mizbeach. Or nitken carbon. It's not a carbon for itself. Ubemele, kann ze bringen, euch beshutfis. And therefore it can be brought also as a partnership. It's not like a carbon mincha. The source of the fact that it can't be brought beshutfis is the comparison to carbon mincha. But that would only be true according to Rabbi's opinion. In other words, what the Rebbe is saying over here is that this whole halacha that the Teres Kainim says that a carbon eitzim cannot be brought b'shutfis, that's Rabbi. Rabbi holds that because Rabbi compares it to a mincha that has all the halachas of a mincha, and therefore this halacha of not being brought b'shutfis applies as well. The Rabbanan, however, that say that it's brought on the mizbech without all the halachas of a mincha, and especially according to the Rambam that says that according to the Rabbanan, the carbon eitzim simply means that it becomes part of the maracha of the mizbeach, even though it has a name carbon, but it becomes part of the maracha of the mizbeach, so it's not compared to a mincha. So therefore the fact that it can't be brought b'shutfis, that there's a limitation by the mincha, does not apply here either. And at the same time, along with the eitzim, they brought other animals as oilis nedave. That could be brought as a partnership, and that's what the families brought together b'shutfis. So according to the Rambam, it's clear where he's paskening like the Rabbanan and not like Rabbi, and therefore there's no problem of it being brought b'shutfis. So now, according to Rashi Ober. However, Rashi has a different approach to what carbon eitzim is. Now, earlier in the Sikhe, the Rebbe said that it seems that Rashi holds like the Rambam, that the lashon of Rashi seemed like that there was the carbon eitzim, and along with the carbon eitzim there were other karbanas that were brought, like the Rambam's opinion. But here the Rebbe will explain that Rashi disagrees with the Rambam. Rashi holds like the Ritva's opinion. Rashi was bepirushay oich a pashtan. Even in the Rashi's pirush on the Gemara is a pashtan. He translates things more to its literal sense. Nitkim paskan. Rashi is not a paisik like the Rambam. Is mefarish kipshute b'mikra b'shas. Rashi explains literally according to the language of the pasik and also the lashon of the Gemara. Carbon eitzim is nit eitzim l'maracha. Carbon eitzim does not mean firewood that's used on the mizbeach. Varam zezen nitkin carbon. The firewood is not a carbon. And most definitely it doesn't have all the details of a regular halacha of a carbon. And therefore Rashi holds the carbon eitzim according to the Rabbanan, even according to the Rabbanan, means it's a carbon eitzim. The carbon itself is the wood itself, that is a carbon for itself. And therefore, because Rashi translates the things in the Gemara literally, Rashi does not say that when the Gemara says that these families brought carbon eitzim, the Gemara means to say that there was another carbon along with the eitzim. That's not the simple pshat. In addition to the fact that the question is, from where should we take this? Why should we say such a chiddush that there was an additional carbon that the Gemara does not say? Is das nit masam lepashtus haloshin carbon eitzim? That's not the literal translation of the words carbon eitzim, which means that the eitzim itself was a carbon. So therefore, according to Rashi, Rashi follows with the Ritva's opinion that it's the eitzim itself that was a carbon. But now, how do we understand the lashon of Rashi when Rashi says that they brought carbon eitzim, the families brought carbon eitzim, and then Rashi says vehoyu makrivin carbon eitzim? That language in Rashi seems like that there's two different things here. There's the carbon eitzim, and then there's another carbon that they brought that day. What's that other carbon? So the pshat here is as follows. And the Rebbe is Oster b'pirushay. So what Rashi is saying is as follows. Be'elu atazmanim. In these 9 time periods, hayu hakayanim va'am, these families of the kayanim and the people, the misnadim lahavi eitzim, they brought the wood. Vayu makrivin carbon oisayim, and they brought a carbon on that day. Even when there was a lot of wood available, hayu elu misnadvim. Umakrivin be'elu tishazmanim. They would donate wood and they would be makriv, the wood, on these 9 times. So the Rebbe is being medayik misnadvin umakrivin, that the wood that was donated as a carbon was divided into 2. It served 2 purposes. It was part of it was a donation for the wood that they needed for the firewood, and part of it was brought as a carbon, as we'll see here. Or the language that Rashi says in another Mishnah, they had the designated times every year. They brought wood for the maracha, and they also brought carbon eitzim. So what does this carbon eitzim mean? Was the phone gufe from this itself was a zok there's a makriv given a carbon. That Rashi says that they brought the carbon eitzim, and they brought a carbon. A carbon with this eitzim. Und is dit mefarish, was is given der carbon? And Rashi does not come and tell us what this carbon was, like the Rambam that says that along with the carbon eitzim, there was animals that they brought as a eilis nadava. Yeshloima, so we can say as ledaita, according to Rashi, lefi pshutun shlokro ma'im razal, according to the simple language of the pasuk where it says carbon ha'eitzim, and the lashon of the Mishnah and the Gemara, which refers to it as carbon eitzim. What does this mean? As the carbon gufe, again, is there carbon given from the eitzim gufe? The carbon was brought from this wood itself. In other words, a chelek from the eitzim, v'zeb menadav given is given l'marache. A part of the wood was for the marache. And a part of it was brought as a separate carbon that's being sacrificed on the Mizbeach. That's Rashi's opinion here. That the eitz that these families donated was split. Part of it was there for the purpose that it was initially intended for, to be for the Marache, to have firewood in the Beis HaMikdash. But then another part of it was sacrificed on the Mizbeach as a carbon for itself. Just like the halacha of carbon eitzim b'chlal, that Rashi, which is a Pashton, teaches, even according to the Rabbanon, that the concept of a carbon eitzim means that the eitzim itself is actually a carbon. Okay, so this answers the question that the Rebbe asked before, that according to the Ritva, and this Rashi now holds like the Ritva as well, if the whole purpose of the carbon was, of the eitzim that is, that they donated was for the marache, so why was the eitzim itself a carbon? So the answer is, yeah, they split it. There was taka, the eitzim that they brought, which was for the maracha, that was their purpose. But because this was a special celebration, a special schus that was given to them, that they're donating this wood, so part of it was separated to be as a carbon for itself. And this also explains the explanation that the Ritva says regarding carbon eitzim, that we can say that the Ritva also agrees to Rashi, the same exact thing that Rashi says, that the carbon eitzim is also split into two. That what they did is they would burn on the Mizbeach itself separately, mina eitzim from this wood, she'es rabu, she'es nadvu, that they had a lot of wood and that they donated, v'zeh hoya carbon eitzim. And this is the carbon eitzim on the Mizbeach. So that's what the Ritva is saying here, that the wood itself was the carbon, right? And this proves to us that the wood itself is a carbon. Ki carbon eitzim mamishu, v'loy shar karbanas shoyim mivim b'yisayim. That the wood itself was the carbon, and not any other karbanas that were brought on this day, along with the eitzim. And the eitzim would only be just firewood. No, the wood itself was the carbon. But even according to the Ritva, that does not mean that all of the wood that these families donated was a carbon for itself. Even according to the Ritva, like you see simply from the Gemara, that the whole point of these families donating this wood was for the purpose of having wood, for the firewood. This is mashma b'pashtus advarim. That's a simple pshat there. However, what the Ritva is coming and telling you is, as das is nit gewenk kim basunde carbon von die suge karbanas hayiduim. This, that with this wood, what they donated then, they also brought a carbon. What was that carbon? The carbon did not come from any of the other usual carbonas that are brought in that day, but rather nor mina eitzim she'es rabu she'es nadvu, from that wood that they donated. So yes, it was donated l'marache to have the firewood in the Beis HaMikdash, but they took from that wood. They had hisrabu, they had extra wood, they had a lot of wood that they took from it, and therefore from that tail, from the eitzim, was they menad given from the Mizbeach. A part of this wood that was brought for the Mizbeach, hat memakir given a carbon eitzim. They took part of it and brought it separately as a carbon eitzim. So that's the pshat in the Rashi and the Ritva, that the carbon comes from the eitzim itself, and the eitzim was split. Part of it was for the marache, and part of it they took to be makriv as a carbon, literally as a carbon eitzim. So now coming back to the question that we asked in the beginning of the Sikha, how could you bring a carbon b'shutfis from the carbon eitzim? And according to Rashi and according to the Ritva, this halacha that you can't bring a carbon eitzim b'shutfis is seemingly even according to the Rabbanon, because according to Rashi, even according to the Rabbanon, the carbon eitzim is a real carbon, similar to a mincha, and therefore you can't bring it b'shutfis. So how do these families bring it b'shutfis? But based on what we just said, that the carbon eitzim was split into two parts, we could answer this question. And with them is moving ladas Rashi v'Ritva. So now we can understand according to Rashi and the Ritva, as in the tes zmanim haben Tage die Mishpachas Menadu gewend, die Eitzim, und an Eufen von Mishpache Shutfis. These families, and these 9 times, they brought the wood as a donation in a partnership, in the families. Und sie haben das gekannt ton, and why could they donate them in a partnership, even though it cannot be brought in a partnership? As does an gewend, not to leave the Eitzim l'maracha. The fact that it says that the families brought it together, that refers to most of the wood. That the point of the donation was for the eitzim as the maracha being used for the firewood in the Beis HaMikdash. And that can be brought in partnership. It's not a carbon, it's just for the firewood. Aber das, was man hat von die eitzim genommen auf makriv sein als carbon eitzim auf dem Mizbeach, this that they took from this wood, part of the wood, and they made it a separate carbon, being brought in the Mizbeach, not as firewood, but actually as a carbon for itself, is das gewähnt nicht bei von Shutfis. That was not being brought as a Shutfis, nor for jede Yachid b'fnei atzmai. Every Yachid, the families, each Yachid itself, took some of the wood and brought it separately as a carbon. Because over here, this is actually a carbon. And regarding this, the halacha that you can't bring b'shutfis applies. So here, each Yachid brought separately. So on one hand, the word the mishpachis, that brought together l'maracha, most of the wood, but then each yachid brought separately his carbon from the wood that was donated as a carbon yachid, and only a yachid could bring it. And that was the celebration of the families, that they had a special carbon, a unique carbon that they brought on this day. So therefore it's not a stira to the fact that the karbanis cannot be brought, the carbon eitzim that is, cannot be brought b'shutfis. The Rebbe adds, af shadeichik ktsas. This is the conclusion of the first section of the Sikha, which explains the halachas of carbon eitzim b'chlal, the machlokes of Rabbi and the Rabbana regarding carbon eitzim b'chlal, and especially according to the opinion of the Rabbana, what's the gather of this carbon eitzim? So the Rambam, Rabbeinu Gershom holds that the carbon eitzim is l'maracha, it's firewood, even though it has a name carbon, but it's firewood in the Mizbeach. And then, but according to the Rashi and the Ritve, it would come out that he holds that according to the Rabbanon, it's a real carbon, even if not a carbon gomor, but it's a carbon, more like the Ravid's opinion. That's the basic machlokes benegeh to the Rabbanon's opinion. And then from there comes out also machlokes regarding the families that donated these karbanis. Since the Rambam holds that the carbon eitzim is just for firewood, so therefore we must say that the only reason for the celebration was because along with this firewood that they donated was also a real carbon, which is a oilis nadava, because the eitzim itself is b'chlal not considered to be a regular carbon in itself, it's just firewood. Mashenkin, according to Rashi, the wood itself is the carbon. And the families, when they donated, they split it. Part of it was for the maracha, and then there was a part of it that each yachid from the families took from this wood to bring separately as a carbon, as a real carbon on the Mizbeach. From here forward, the Rebbe takes this machlokes of Rabbi and the Rabbanon, which was based on the idea of when you look at a word in the Torah, whether you have to teach it literally or just in some details or in some aspect, you find this machlokes in other places as well. Yeshleima kanal, we could say, like we mentioned before, as in der machlokes from Rabbi with the Rabbanim and it's a carbon eitzim. This argument they have here regarding carbon eitzim, whether it's literally and fully or not, gains a yedel l'shitase b'kama mekayim b'shas. We find that they follow their opinions in other places in Shas umehem, and from those places are the following: in Seder Zrayim, Masechta Brachas. One is Yifav Masechta Brachas and machlokes Kriya Shema. The halacha of saying Kriya Shema. Chsava divrei Rabbi. Rabbi says that Kriya Shema must be said in the way it's written in the Torah, which is Lashon Kodesh. Chachamim say that you can read Kriya Shema in any language. Which means, Rabbi halt, as the Chiyuv from Kriya Shema, darf sein genoi mit alle pratim. To say the Kriya Shema has to be exactly the way the parshas are written in the Torah, with all details. Wie die Parshas stehen in the Torah, euch in der Prat von Chsava, as it's written in the language in Lashon HaKodesh. The Rabbanan alten aber, however, Rabbanan follow their approach as is maspik b'chol lashon. It doesn't have to be exact, precise in the Lashon Kodesh. You can say Kriya Shema in any language. The darf nicht haben, as it soll sein, euch kiksava. It does not have to be said as written in the Torah. Nor says genug, das was the teichen in is Kriya Shema. Saying it in any language is the same content, and that is good enough. So here we see the same concept that they're arguing whether it has to be literally and exactly in the language, like it's written in the Torah, or it's enough that it's the same content. Unchach, as the Gemara is masber, as the taimim from Rabbi v'Rabbanan. So it seems from the Gemara that the basis of their machlokes is not this approach or this logical argument that they have in other places, but rather it's simply based on the drashas of psukim. My time in the Rabbi, the Gemara says, what's the basis of Rabbi's opinion? O makra, because the Torah says v'hoyu. In Kriya Shema it says v'hoyu, which means b'havyasan yiyu. Leave it as is. You have to read it as is. V'Rabbanan my taimayu, and then what's the reasoning for the opinion of the Rabbanan? O makra shma. The Torah says Shema, which is b'chaloshin shata shemeya. The term Shema means including in any language where a person hears the content of Shema. So it seems like that it's based on the drashas of the psukim, not the general machlokes of whether we translate things literally or not so literal. Is aber the lishitasi anal, the explanation that was said before, the sibbe, that this is really the reason for was Rabbi nemton dafke dem drashim v'hoyu. This is what pushes Rabbi to focus more on the word v'hoyu, that it should be literal, und the Rabbanan dem drash from Shema b'chaloshin. And the Rabbanan say that no, we focus on the word Shema to say b'chaloshin. The basis of their machlokes is the general machlokes that they have, whether we look at things kipshutai or not kipshutai. And that is what brings them minigay to how you interpret the pasuk of Ahoyu and Shema. And as I is moving from them was the Gemara's mamshich. We understand this also from the continuation of what the Gemara says there. The Gemara discusses there, so you have two drashas, Ahoyu and Shema. So each opinion sees both of these drashas. Now the question though is, where do you put the emphasis? And the Gemara there says as follows. Lememre, shall we say according to Rabbi that says that you learn from Vahayu, from this special pasuk, that Shema must be said only in Lashon HaKodesh, the Sava Rabbi that Rabbi would hold, that any other times when you read from the Torah, you can read from the Torah in any language. If you're going to tell me that always you only read B'Lashon HaKodesh, why do I need a specific word to tell me here regarding Kriya Shema that it must be B'Lashon HaKodesh? It always has to be B'Lashon HaKodesh. So the Gemara there explains, it's tzrich. Even if it's true that you always have to read from the Torah only B'Lashon HaKodesh, I still need a special pasuk here by Shema. Shema, because it says the word Shema that would indicate that by Kriya Shema it's different, that it could be said in any language, so therefore you need the Vahayu to say that no, that Kriya Shema must be said dafke in Lashon Kodesh. Similarly, the Gemara says in the reverse according to the Rabbanan. Shall we say that the Rabbanan that require a special pasuk of Shema to teach me that Kriya Shema could be said in any language, so that must mean that in the rest of Torah, when you read from the Torah, it must be said only in Lashon HaKodesh. If you're going to say that whenever you read from the Torah, you could read in any language, Shema the Kasav Rachman Alamali. So then why do I need a special pasuk here by Shema to teach me that it can be said in any language? And again, the Gemara gives the same answer. Since over here it says Vahayu, and Rabbi darshans from Vahayu that it means only Lashon Kodesh, so I would think that this is different than the rest of Torah. So therefore I need Shema to tell you that no, that even here it's like the rest of Torah, and it can be read in any language. So what do we understand from this discussion in the Gemara? Das heißt, as the etzem svare is machriach let Rabbi as Kriya Shema dav zayin kiksava. The source of Rabbi's opinion and the source of the Rabbanan's opinion are not the words of Vahayu and Shema itself. It's the general shitta that they have regarding kichsava or b'chaloshin, whether you approach things literally, that has to be exactly like in the Torah, or it could be in any language, as long as it's the same content. That's really the source of their argument. On the limud from the psukim, and then the way they approach the psukim, the two words, the Vahayu and Shema, is not zu bavaranin und shaylo zayin the mashmas hafchis from the zweiten pasuk. Once Rabbi has his approach that he wants to translate things literally, so therefore he says that Vahayu is coming to negate the Shema, that it should be literal. And when the Rabbanah that have their general approach that things do not have to be exactly literal, as long as it's the same content of what it says here, so therefore they say no, Shema is coming to negate the Vahayu, that it's enough that if it's even in any other language, as long as it's the same content. So this is one place in Masechta Brachos and Seder Zrayim where we see this argument. In Seder Mayid Masechta Sukkah, we find similar an argument in Masechta Sukkah where it's the same approach of this argument. Rabbi says, "Kol Sukkah Shem Bar Amas Al Arba Amas Psula." A sukkah that's not the size, the minimum size of 4x4 amas will be possible. Even a sukkah that's only large enough for most of the person's body to enter into it, ksheira. That's enough that it will be kosher, which I believe is 7 tvachim. So they're arguing about the minimum size of a sukkah. What's the basis of this argument? In Torah state, basukis teishvu shivas yamim, that a person has to live in the sukkah for 7 days. What does the term teishvu mean? Zok the Gemara as darf sein teishvu ke'en taduru. You have to sit and live in the sukkah the same way you live in your house. So therefore, here the question is, how literal do we take this? Halt Rabbi, so the approach of Rabbi is, as the teishvu ke'en taduru, darf sein kipshutei b'chol hapratim. It should be literal and with all the details. Und der Fahrt of the sukkah haben, dal damas, ke'en taduru, mamish von Abai. It's just like in a house. The minimum space of a house is 4 amas by 4 amas. Therefore, a sukkah has to be no less than the minimum space of the size of a person's house. Chavim halten, as es muss nicht sein, ke'en taduru kipshute b'chol hapratim. The ke'en taduru, that your sukkah should be like you live in your house, does not have to be literal and with all the details. Not as is genug, ke'en taduru. Somewhat similar to the way you live in your house. In den Prat, was is machzekes reishi v'rubai. In the sense that most of your head and most of your body can enter into the sukkah. Adias arai, it's only a temporary dwelling, und es kann dort sein yeshiva. It's possible to sit there. Teishvu. That you said you can sit there even though you can't live there fully like in your house. Man darf aber nicht haben euch der binyan sukkah soll sein kein taduru. You don't need that the actual structure of the sukkah itself should be built. The sukkah should be built mamish like a house with the space of 4 by 4 amas. So here again we see the machlokes regarding a sukkah. How far do we take the teishvu kein taduru? Does this mean that the sukkah has to be mamish like a house? Or it's enough that the person could live inside the sukkah, diras arai, somewhat similar to a house? Similar, we find the machlokes between Rabbi and the Rabbanon regarding the language of people when they speak. In Seder Noshim, how literal should we take the words that a person says? When a person says, Rabbi says, when a person uses the term on condition, what it really means to say that the action that he's doing should take effect now. And the Rabbanan argue on this. So what are we talking about here? So for example, this refers to a person that's giving a get. And he says as follows, here, this is your get. So he's actually doing the action of giving her a get right here and now. But then he adds, on condition that you give me 200 zuz. So what's the halacha? When does the divorce take effect? Is he loit Rabbi mugureshes me'achshav? According to Rabbi, when he gives her the 200 zuz, so retroactively, the gedushin takes effect from the moment that he gave it to her, right then. The gedushin only comes into effect later. When he gave her the Messiah Zuz, that's when it takes effect. So that's the machlokes here. The term almanas. Does almanas mean me'achshav, that the gedushin will take effect now, or it only takes effect later when he gives her that money, when he fulfills the condition, or that is she fulfills the condition and gives him the money. Now, Shittis Rabbi is, so here again we see this machlokes, this approach in their argument, whether we should translate and understand what the person said literally or not. So Rabbi's opinion is, as b'shas is da dibur, when a person says something, and there's an action that he's doing right now. Right now he's actually physically giving her a get. Even though he's making a condition with something that she has to do later to give him money. But we accept and translate what he's saying literally with all the details, which means he's doing the action now. There's no strings attached. As far as the physical action that's being done, he's doing the whole action now. Not that is nice of almanas. He's adding a condition. As he soll danach mekayim sein die pulas at night. She should then go ahead and fulfill the condition. But that doesn't mean that the action of the get will stay on hold until later. The action is fully done now. Und der Rebbe sagt as kolayim almanas, as punkt wie wollt gesagt me'achshav, when a person makes a condition, it's as if he said, me'achshav. We want to look at what he's doing, the action that he does, and the words that he's saying in the most literal sense. He's giving her the get now, so the get takes effect now. He makes a condition, so the condition will be will be fulfilled later. But the gedushin will take effect retroactively from when he already did the full action before. That's the most literal and simple way how to interpret what this person's intention is. The Rabbanan halten, however, the Rabbanan's approach is, as mekenet mechadish zayin, moisev zayin me'achshav. You can't go and be mechadish that the term almanas, so he's depending the get to taking effect on this, on a certain condition, so you can't go ahead and say that this almanas means that retroactively the get will be chal immediately when it was given. Chach, as b'li achidish, even though if you're not going to say that, if you're not going to be mechadish, that he means to say right now, v'ti maise the amira nitzayin kipshutam. So then it's going to come out that the action and the words that he's doing, so you can't really translate what's happening here literally. On one hand, you see he's doing the action of the get right now, but he's depending it on a condition. So you can't allow, how is the maisa gerushin going to take effect now? If he's connecting it to a condition, so it's going to have to delay the action that's actually being done now. So you can't allow literally for it to take effect now. On the Rebbe is saying, therefore they say, as the get is chalesh speter. So because of this almanas, the action will not take effect immediately and literally, but it's going to be delayed to later. When sie is mekayim dem tnai, only after the tnai is fulfilled. So here again you see the Rabbanan's approach that we don't translate his intention literally of how he's doing it, but we delay it with the almanas that he said later. Another place, Ot der Lishitase von Rabbi in der Rabbanan gefindt ben euch beim Abplanen ein Inyan von der zweiten Begseide Shava. We find an argument between Rabbi and the Rabbanan when we learn out one subject from another Begseide Shava. When we learn a Gzeide Shava, so the question is, how far does this limud, does this Gzeide Shava go? In Seidin Ezekiel Mesechta Sanhedrin. So this is a Gemara in Sanhedrin where it says as follows: Hizid b'meile, which means b'shas einat moil given b'meizid and hektish. Someone went and used an item from hektish for his own personal thing, b'meizid, intentionally. Rabbi Yoime b'misa. Rabbi says that this person is going to be liable for death. Misa b'dei shemayim, that is. Chachamim say that there's a hazara, there's a lav that is over, but not misa. Now, my time with the Rebbe, what's the source for what Rebbe says? Amar Abavo, so Abavo says, because Gomar chet mitrume. There's a Gzeide Shava, the word chet that says by Me'ila and what it says by Trume, and we compare them. Ma lahalam b'misa, just like by Trume. The Torah clearly says that eating truma, zar that eats truma is chayiv misa, afkam b'misa. So to buy me'ila, you chayiv misa if you're moil b'mezit. But Rabbanan Amri, but the Rabbanan says, even though there is a Gzeide Shava, but nevertheless, Amakra, the Torah says, boy, umeisu boy ki chalalu, I believe is the pasuk that says, by truma. Boy v'loy b'me'ila. So therefore that boy tells me that only by truma there's misa and not by me'ila. So therefore we don't take this Gzeide Shava to its fullest extent. So what do we see here? Leit Rabbi, wie bald the ganze din von Mila bei Hektisch wird abgelernt bei Gzeide Shava von Trume, since the entire halacha that a person shouldn't be mile and hektish is learned out with Gzeide Shava from Trume, darf man annehmen as die Teire meint limud bepashtus und b'chol ha'pratim oich legabe misa. So we take this Gzeide Shava fully and literally with all the details, including the punishment of misa. But according to the Rabbanan, yes, the Rabbanan agree that we do learn the Gzeide Shava chet from Trume. Und the far is da an azhare when hizid b'me'ile. And therefore, when a person is b'mezid mile, there is a isser, there's a lav that he's over, or azhara that the person is over. V'balt aber as lefishi tasam is the limud b'gzeide shave lav dafke kipshutai or b'chol pratim. So therefore, this limud that we're comparing them through this gzeide shave does not have to be literal, and it does not have to be with all the details. Halten ze der Rebbe as gefinnende kamiyat from boy. If we see that there's a miyat from another pasuk where it says boy, what does this do? Is memayit hizid b'meila from misa. That even though he's amazed from the Me'ila, but nevertheless, there's no Misa for this. Because the Rabbanan say, when you make a Gzeide Shava, it does not have to be fully and literally. Again, we see the same approach of their Machlekes here in a Machlekes and Seidin Ezekiel. Based on this we could say, as the Lishitase Anal from Rabbi and the Rabbanan, gefind ben euch in the Machlekes. We find this in another argument, Funit Rabbanan. It's not the Rabbanan that are arguing with Rabbi, nor a Yachid is the Bar Plukta from Rabbi. It's another Tana, another individual, which is arguing with Rabbi. As the Bar Plukta from Rabbi get lefi shittas Rabbanan in the Machlekes Anal. And the one that argues with Rabbi here is also following the same logic in the Machlekes between Rabbi and the Rabbanan, whether you should translate a pasuk or a mishnah or a din literally and fully, or not necessarily fully, only in one aspect or in one detail. In Say the Kachim, so we find this in Say the Kachim in Mesechta Menachos. So it says there as follows: Klishares she'asan shaleitz. A person made one of the kelim, the klishares in the Beis Hamikdash, from wood. Could this be used as a keli for the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash? Rabbi Paisel. Rabbi says it has to be made from a metal. It can't be made from a eitz, from wood. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, machsher. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda says that it is kosher, even from wood. But Maika Miflagi, what's the source of their drasha? So the Gemara explains, Rabbi Darish Klali Uprati. Rabbi has a method where he dashes the psukim with klal uprat, which we'll explain in a moment what this method is. And Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda Darish Riboy Umiyuti. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda's approach is that you dash in with a riboy and a miyut, which comes out with a different conclusion that you can use even wood for a klisharis. Now, what is this talking about? So the Gemara there explains, Rabbi Darish Klali Uprati, as follows. What does it say in the Torah regarding the menorah? As one example of a keli in the Beis HaMikdash, and from there we learn from the other kelim. So it says in the Torah, Vasisa menorahs. You should build a menorah. So when the Torah writes menorahs, if it would not specify what kind of menorah, so that's klal. It's just telling you to build a menorah, not specifying what kind of material it should be. But then it says zahav. It specifically specifies that it should be of gold. Zahav Torah, that is, of pure gold. So that's a prat. The Torah is specifying and excluding. It could be only from gold. But then it says in the Torah again, Miksha te'asa amenorah. The menorah should be made of one piece, that you shape the menorah from one piece. And the Torah is this, so this is chazar v'kolal. And the Torah here is writing again in a general term that you should just make the menorah. This is what's called, according to Rabbi, a klal uprat uklal. When the Torah first writes a mitzvah, or it could be a isser, it could be whatever it is, the Torah first writes it in a general term, then the Torah specifies, and then the Torah repeats again, and there, when it repeats it a second time, it writes it as a klal. A klal uprat uklal. So how do we learn? What do we understand from? What does the Torah want? Does the Torah want it to be specific as the prat is? But on the other hand, it says a klal and another klal. So what is the meaning here? So therefore, Rabbi says, Iyatadon ela ke'ena prat. On one hand, the fact that there's a klal and another klal means that the prat that was specified does not have to be literal, only this and nothing else. But even if there's something else, but it has to be similar to the prat. Therefore, I say here as follows: Ma prat mefurish al matchis. Just like what was specified here is kind of metal, which is gold. Av kol shal matchis. Even if you're going to say that because the Torah wrote a klal and a prat and a klal, so we have to add more, but we're going to add very limited. Only something which is similar to the prat, which is another kind of a metal. Therefore, wood is excluded. Any klisharis made of wood is not ke'ena prat. That's Rabbi's approach. That's one method. Klal prat klal. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda Darish Ribui Miyuti. He has a different method. When you have this kind of a pasuk, he darshans it with a different method. When the Torah writes Vasisa menorahs riba, says menorahs, it's adding and including and saying anything, any material. Make a menorah of any material. Then it says of Torah, it specifies only pure gold. Miyut, so that's coming to exclude something. Then it says again, Miksha teyasa menorah, make the menorah of any material as long as it's one piece. Chazav eriba, it's coming and adding again that you can make it from any material. So Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda's approach is different. Riba, umiyit, and riba. That the Torah is coming to add, and adding and saying that you could do anything. There is a miyut. The fact that the Torah put in there zav tar, there is a miyut, which means we have to be memayit something. So we're going to find something to be memayit. But in general, we're going to approach this with more of an inclusive approach that anything could be made, because it says a ribi in the beginning and a ribi in the end. The miyut in the middle is not to say that it has to be mamish ke'ena prat. The miyut in the middle is only being memayit one specific example. So therefore I say that riba hakail, that the Torah is being marba, you can make the menorah, and for that matter, any klishat is from any material. Umay riba kol mili, anything. Umay miyit, and then when there's a miyut, when there's an exclusion, what is it coming to be memayit? Only one very specific case, miyut shal cheres. Only a cheres, which is a very, very low grade of material, which is not honorable for the Beis HaMikdash. Only a cheres is something which we're memayit. Anything other than a cheres, we're marba. So what do we see over here? We see again the same approach of when you have an option of these two methods of klal or prata klal or riba miyat riba. This follows the approach of Rabbi versus the Rabbanan, or in this case Rav Yosef Rabbi Yehuda. Ledas Rabbi was halt as a limud v'riboy. But when you marb something from a word in the Torah is vasmer kipshutai. We try to interpret as much as possible, as literal as possible as it's written in the Torah. Und in was mehr praten gleich So the minyan velachem is marbe olaymed, and as much as possible in the details of what you're learning from, that's written there in the Torah. So therefore, is darish klali uprati. So therefore, he uses the method of klal prata klal, versus marbe nar ke'ena prat. So according to him, what your memayit is much more. It's much more literal, and what your marbe is only ke'ena prat, only what's similar to the prat, daimim le prat, which is only metal in this case. Rabbi Yehuda was gate b'shittis Rabbanon the Rabbi. Rabbi Yehuda, which is following the opinion of the Rabbanon that argue with Rabbi in many places, as oich, v'sis doad, dimyon, in ein prat v'chayetz b'zeh. Even a comparison in just one detail, hatas hashaychis u'mekenes anrufen b'shem hamakir. So that's enough of a connection, and I can label it. I can give it a name similar to this itself, kibe'inyanenu, carbon ha'etzim. Just like over here regarding the carbon ha'etzim, it's not at all a carbon. It's brought in the mizbeach as firewood. Elamai, in one detail, it's like a carbon, that it's on the Mizbeach. Or the other pshat that we said before, okay, that's not exactly the Rabbanim, what the Rambam says. Okay, so we see that the concept does not have to be taich literally. Is darish ribu miyuti. So therefore, he takes the approach that when you have this scenario of menorahs and then zav toir and then miksha teyasa menorah, so I take the more inclusive approach. It doesn't have to be so literal to exclude so much. And therefore he uses the method of ribi miyit and ribi. Was ribi kol mili, and I include anything. Oich das was divas nid b'daimel aprat, even what's not similar to what's specified in the pasuk. Umiyit nor shal cheres. And we're only going to exclude cheres, earthenware, versus pachis mikola kalim, which is the lowest and the least and inferior quality of all vessels. And even a king of flesh and blood would not use such a kind of a keli. So here we see that Rabbanon, Rabbi Yehuda goes in the opinion of the Rabbanon, which is more inclusive, and it doesn't have to be so specific and so similar to the actual detail mentioned in the pasuk. Finally, the Rebbe concludes with the last example in Seder Taris, an inyan in Taris, something that we find regarding the halachas of Taris, where we see the same machlokes. Hanichnas le'eretz ha'amim, a person that enters into a place outside of Eretz Yisrael. And there's a gzeira, the chachamim will geizer that the airspace in Eretz Ha'amim, if you enter there, you become tamei. So, but he entered not just walking or riding and so on, but he entered b'shida teva migdal. He was carried in a closet or in some kind of a box. So Rabbi mitame. Rabbi says that's considered to be an entry into Eretz Ha'amim, and you will be tamei. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda mitayr. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda says that if you enter in such a interesting, unusual manner, you'll still be tahir. So what's the basis of the argument here? Mar savar oil zarek lav shmei oil. Rabbi's opinion is this is not the normal entry. Usually a person walks in, or in any other way that a person enters into the airspace of Eretz Amim. Here, he's inside of a closet, or maybe today if you're flying in an airplane, you're inside something which is not literally the way you usually walk in. So therefore that's not called, this oil that you entered into is not called a regular oil. It's an oil zarek, it's an oil that's in the air, and therefore does not have the status of an oil. So the gzeira of the chachamim that you would become tamei being in an oil in Eretz Amim does not apply. Omar Savar, but Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda holds oil zarek shmei oil. That even oil, though it's in the air, but nevertheless it still has the status of an oil, although it's not exactly similar to a regular oil, and therefore you will be tamei. So here again we see the same machlokes. L'das Rabbi, according to Rabbi's opinion, Kidei an oil, so chaytzit zayin b'fnei atumeh, in order that an oil should have the ability to separate from the tumeh, darfer zayin gleich to an oil b'chol aprotim v'sez nit metaltel. So this has to be an oil that is similar to a regular oil with all the pratim. That what's an oil? Oil is usually a place that you could be metaltel. You can't be metaltel. That is, you can't move it around. And that's what makes it a regular oil. Demol tal teradina oil of nit chaytzit zayin. Then it will have the halacha of an oil, and it's not going to be chaytzit on the tumah. The gzeira of the chachamim will apply over there. But on the other hand, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda says, "Agam, this is nit gleich b'chol hapratim to an oil. This oil that the person is inside of is not like a regular oil. He's in the air in it. It's oil zadok. But wie bald, aber as es is gleich in dem, was das is a mokim la'atzmai, but still it is a designated place for itself. So in some sense it's similar to an oil, hot es adin von oil, and it says chaytzis b'fnei tumah. So therefore this has a halacha of an oil, and therefore it will be chaytzis on the tumah, kushitis rabbanan anal, And like the opinion of the Rabbanan, that even if it's only similar in one sense, that's good enough. And therefore, v'toid is going to be toy when he enters into the Eretz Ha'amim in this Shida, Teva, Umigdal. This is, again, we see here the same approach of the machlokes between Rabbi and the Rabbanan in this inyan.